Amelie was a quiet woman from Cape Town who worked hard and lived carefully. She wasn't flashy, she didn't chase after status, and she never cared about being seen. What mattered to her was keeping her family safe and their home secure. Month after month, she paid the bills, cleared the credit cards, and made sure the mortgage never slipped. When Kwame, her husband, wanted to start a business, it was Amelie who signed the papers, took the loans, and even refinanced the land her late father left her. Every debt had her name on it, every sacrifice came from her. But to the world, it looked very different. People saw Kwame driving new cars, wearing sharp suits, and stepping out like a king. They called him a genius, a self-made mogul who had built his empire from nothing. Friends and investors praised him, raised glasses in his honor, and copied his every move. Amelie stood quietly by his side, never correcting them, never letting anyone know the truth. She let him shine, even if it meant she was left in the shadows. What nobody saw was that Kwame's empire was just a show. The foundation of all his wealth, all his power, came from Amelie's endless work and sacrifice. She was the real backbone, the one holding everything up, but she never received the credit. To the world, Kwame was the star. But behind the scenes, Amelie was the reason the lights were still on. The night was meant to be a celebration. The restaurant sparkled with golden lights, glasses of wine clinked, and Kwame sat at the head of the table surrounded by his investors, laughing louder than anyone else. Amelie sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the stories he told. He boasted about his brilliance, his hard work, his clever business moves. Not once did he mention her. And then, in front of everyone, he looked at her and smirked. "She's just a housewife," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The men at the table laughed. Amelie forced a small smile, but inside her heart ached. She wanted to remind him that every bill, every loan, every sacrifice was hers. But she stayed silent. When they got home, the celebration was over, but Kwame's ego was still raging. The sky outside had opened up, rain pouring down in heavy sheets, thunder rolling through the night. They argued. His voice was sharp, cruel, cutting through her silence. He accused her of being ungrateful, of not appreciating the life he had built. Amelie stood still, her hands trembling, and for once she looked at him with tired eyes. That only made him angrier. In a burst of fury, he pulled her by the arm and dragged her outside into the storm. The cold rain slapped her face, soaking her clothes until they clung to her skin. Her hair dripped, her body shivered, but his words stung more than the weather. "You're worthless," he shouted over the thunder. "Without me, you'd be nothing. You should be grateful for me." His words echoed like poison. Amelie stood there, drenched and humiliated, her heart pounding. But in that moment, a cruel truth hit her harder than the rain. Everything he claimed as his, the mansion, the cars, the business empire, was built on her back. She was the one who signed the papers, who paid the loans, who covered the debts. She was the one who had given up her inheritance, her peace, her dreams. And yet here he was, calling her worthless in the very storm she had shielded him from all these years. For the first time, Amelie did not feel weak in the silence. She did not argue or cry. She simply looked at him, standing tall despite the storm, and realized something he would never understand. He thought he was the empire. But the truth was, she was the foundation. And without her, he was nothing more than a man drowning in his own lies. As the rain poured down, Amelie made no sound, but inside her heart something shifted. It was the night of humiliation, but it was also the night she finally woke up. She understood then that storms do not only destroy, they also wash things clean. And soon, she knew, her silence would become her greatest weapon. Amelie sat alone at the dining table late at night, the rain from earlier still dripping against the windows. The house was silent, but inside her mind the noise was unbearable. She opened the drawer where she had kept everything neatly stacked over the years, receipts, bank statements, loan agreements. One by one, she pulled them out and spread them across the table. The papers told a story nobody else knew. Every credit card bill carried her name. Every utility payment was signed by her. The mortgage, too, had her signature pressed into it. It was not Kwame's empire. It was hers, built quietly in the shadows while he stood in the spotlight. The flashbacks came to her like old scars. She remembered the day she walked into the bank with her father's land papers, land that had been in her family for generations. The land her father dreamed would one day provide her security. She had refinanced it, handing over her heritage so Kwame's business could have one more chance. She told herself it was for their future together, that one day he would understand the weight of what she had given. But he never asked. He never even noticed. She remembered paying school fees, fixing broken cars, clearing debts before they became scandals, all while Kwame stood smiling in his new suit, telling the world how brilliant he was. Investors shook his hand, cameras flashed, and speeches praised him. And all the while, Amelie was in the background, quietly making sure the light stayed on and the bank didn't take their home. The cruel irony made her chest tighten. The empire people admired was not the fruit of Kwame's genius but the result of her endless sacrifice. His wealth was only an illusion, a castle of glass held up by her steady hands. Without her, the walls would crack. Without her, the roof would fall. Yet he had called her worthless, blind to the truth that she was the only reason he could even pretend to be a king. Amelie picked up one of the receipts and stared at her own handwriting on it. Her name, written over and over again, was like a mirror showing her the life she had been living. She realized she had not just paid for bills, she had paid for silence, for dignity, for his pride. She had allowed herself to disappear so that he could shine. And the world had believed the lie because she had allowed it. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of clarity. For the first time, she saw herself as she truly was, the backbone, the shelter, the reason the empire stood at all. Kwame had never noticed, and perhaps he never would. But she noticed now. She saw every line, every number, every sacrifice. And she knew the truth, the empire was hers, and when she decided to stop carrying it, it would all come crashing down. Amelie lay awake that night, the storm still echoing in her mind. The rain had soaked her body, but it had also washed something clean inside her. For years she had carried the weight of a world that was never hers, pretending that silence was love, pretending that sacrifice was enough. But as she replayed Kwame's words, worthless, over and over in her head, something inside her shifted. She finally understood that she was not the weak one in their story. She was the strength. And now it was time to stop giving it away. The next morning, while Kwame was already on the phone bragging to an investor about his brilliant strategies, Amelie moved quietly around the house. She pulled out boxes, files, and envelopes, gathering every document that carried her name. She lined them up on the table, bank statements, property deeds, loan agreements, receipts. Every single one whispered the same truth: she had been the foundation. She slipped the papers into a folder, her hands steady, her mind clear. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finally taking something back. Days turned into weeks, and while Kwame spent his nights drinking champagne at high-profile events, showing off his empty wealth, Amelie was making her own quiet plans. He thought she was still the silent wife waiting at home. But she was already gone in spirit, already building her escape piece by piece. She visited the bank in secret, she spoke to lawyers in hushed tones, and she made copies of everything. She did not shout, she did not fight, she prepared. She thought about her daughter most of all. The little girl had watched her mother move in the shadows, always tired, always putting others first. Amelie promised herself that her daughter would never inherit that silence. She would not grow up believing that love meant losing yourself. This exit wasn't just for Amelie, it was for the child who deserved to see her mother free, strong, and unafraid. Kwame, blind in his arrogance, noticed nothing. He laughed on red carpets, raised his glass at fancy dinners, and shook hands with men who called him visionary. He didn't see the small shifts at home, didn't notice the locked drawer that was now empty, didn't care that Amelie's eyes no longer looked at him with love but with quiet distance. He thought he was untouchable. But Amelie knew the truth: every empire built on lies eventually falls. She had been holding up the walls for too long, and soon she would step aside. When she left, she would not only leave the house, she would leave the entire illusion behind. And when it collapsed, as she knew it would, she would not even need to say a word. Her silence would speak louder than anything Kwame had ever shouted. The morning was calm, almost too calm, the kind of morning where the sky was soft and pale, as if nothing in the world was about to change. Amelie woke early, her daughter still sleeping peacefully beside her. She packed only the essentials, some clothes, a few photographs, important papers she had already tucked safely away. One suitcase was all she carried, because she wasn't leaving with weight. She was leaving with freedom. There was no shouting, no fight, no slammed doors. She didn't need drama. Her power was in the silence. She dressed her daughter, kissed her on the forehead, and whispered, "We're going." The child trusted her completely, holding her hand as they stepped out of the house that had once felt like a cage. But Amelie didn't leave the house empty. On the dining table she laid out everything: neatly arranged folders, bills with her name, property deeds showing her ownership, loans she alone had guaranteed. It looked less like paper and more like evidence, the truth laid bare in black and white. Anyone who stepped into that room would see it instantly: Kwame's empire was nothing without her. He had been living in a dream, and she had just left him to wake up in a nightmare. Kwame didn't notice at first. He was too busy polishing his shoes for another meeting, too wrapped up in his own reflection. He didn't see the empty drawer, the missing suitcase, or the silence where his wife's presence used to be. It wasn't until hours later, when his phone began buzzing with calls from anxious investors, that the cracks began to show. The voices on the other end weren't congratulating him anymore. They were demanding answers. Why were there unpaid bills under Amelie's name? Why were the loans guaranteed only by her? Why were properties legally tied to her instead of him? One by one, the questions piled up, and Kwame had none of the answers. He had never looked at the fine print, never cared to know. Now the fine print was shouting at him louder than any praise he had ever received. Amelie didn't look back. She walked down the street with her daughter, suitcase rolling quietly behind her, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She wasn't walking away in anger, she was walking toward peace. She knew that by leaving the documents behind, she had left a storm that would swallow Kwame whole. She didn't need to ruin him herself, the truth would do it for her. For the first time, Amelie breathed without fear. No empire, no illusion, no humiliation, just her and her daughter, free at last. She didn't need to announce her departure. She didn't need a goodbye. The silence she left behind spoke louder than any words ever could. And in that silence, Kwame's world would finally collapse. At first, Kwame didn't feel the shift. He still wore his sharp suits, still polished his cars, and still strutted into meetings as if nothing in the world could touch him. But Amelie's silence had left a trail, and soon that trail turned into a flood. The first call came from the bank, a polite but firm reminder about unpaid balances. Then came the supplier who refused to deliver more stock until past invoices were cleared. At first Kwame brushed it off, promising money that didn't exist, believing somehow that things would fix themselves. But within days, the calls multiplied, each one louder, angrier, more urgent. Kwame had no answers. For years, it had been Amelie who soothed worried investors, Amelie who balanced the books, Amelie who kept the wolves from the door. Without her steady hand, the empire began to show what it truly was, an empty shell built on borrowed time. He sat at his desk surrounded by letters stamped, "Final Notice," his phone buzzing with numbers he no longer wanted to answer. The very people who once toasted him now demanded explanations he could not give. The investors noticed first. They remembered Amelie's calm voice, her quiet reassurances, the way she always had paperwork ready. Now, in her absence, there was only Kwame's stuttering, his empty promises, his arrogance cracking under pressure. One by one, they withdrew their money. They had trusted the empire only because Amelie's name had been behind it. Without her, there was nothing left to believe in. Soon the seizures began. The mansion with its glittering chandeliers was the first to go, repossessed by the bank. Then the sleek cars that once lined the driveway disappeared one by one, towed away under the watchful eyes of neighbors who whispered as they passed. The business offices, once buzzing with activity, were locked shut as creditors claimed their share. Kwame, who once stepped out like royalty, now found himself stranded, forced to walk past the very people who once bowed to him. The fall was fast, brutal, and public. His name, once celebrated in headlines, now became a warning. Articles exposed his debts, investors called him a fraud, and whispers spread about the wife who had carried everything on her back. The image he had spent years crafting, of a billionaire mogul, untouchable and brilliant, shattered overnight. Kwame looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the man staring back. The suits no longer fit, the pride was gone from his eyes, and the silence of the house screamed louder than any insult Amelie had ever endured. He finally stood in the ruins of the empire he thought was his, but it had never been his to begin with. It had been Amelie's sacrifice holding it together, and the moment she walked away, it crumbled like dust in the wind. And for the first time, Kwame understood what true emptiness felt like. Amelie started her new life with nothing but determination and the little she had saved, but for the first time, she was building for herself. She went back to the land she had once sacrificed, the land her late father left her. It had been tied up in Kwame's debts, but now, free from him, it was hers again. Standing there, breathing in the open air, she felt like her father was watching, proud that his gift was finally being used to give her strength instead of weighing her down. From that land, Amelie planted the seeds of her future. She registered a logistics company in Durban, and this time, every paper, every document, every signature carried only her name. She worked quietly but with focus. She kept her accounts clean, every receipt carefully stored, every transaction transparent. Her employees quickly learned that Amelie was different from most bosses. She paid on time, treated everyone with respect, and never flaunted her success. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, so she made sure those who worked for her were seen and valued. Slowly but surely, the company grew. Trucks rolled out with her logo painted proudly on the side, and clients admired her reliability. Her story, though, did not stay hidden. People began to whisper about her, not as the wife of Kwame, but as Amelie herself, the woman who had carried a false empire and then walked away without a sound. Online, her story spread like wildfire. Posts called her, the silent wife, the woman who let a fake king's castle collapse simply by stepping aside. Pictures of her, standing strong in front of her new company, circulated on social media. People admired not just her strength but the way she never sought revenge with words, she let the truth speak for her. Meanwhile, Kwame's downfall became part of the story. The same investors who once cheered for him now admitted they had always trusted Amelie more. Journalists wrote about the irony, the man who called his wife worthless had lost everything the moment she left. The contrast made Amelie shine even brighter. She didn't need to humiliate him, his own lies had done that. Amelie never gloated. She never called to say, "I told you so." Instead, she poured her energy into building something real, something lasting. She wanted her daughter to see a mother who had fallen but stood up stronger than before. Every time she signed a paycheck or saw her trucks on the road, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing this was hers, built with her own hands and in her own name. Her revenge was not loud or cruel. It was simple and powerful, she thrived while he crumbled. And the world watched, amazed, as the woman once ignored in the shadows became the true face of resilience. Amelie had finally stepped into her own light, and she never looked back. The rain was falling heavy again, just like that night when everything had changed. Amelie stood outside her new headquarters, the glass building glowing behind her with the name of her company written boldly across it. She was no longer the silent wife in the shadows, she was the woman everyone respected, the leader of her own empire. Employees hurried in and out of the building, trucks lined the street with her logo, and despite the storm, there was a sense of life and progress around her. Through the blur of rain, she saw him. Kwame. His once perfect suit was wrinkled, his shoes splashing in muddy puddles as he stumbled toward her. The pride he used to wear like armor was gone. His eyes were tired, desperate, hollow. He called her name, his voice breaking, no longer the voice of a king but of a man who had lost everything. He begged her for help, begged her to save him from the mess he could no longer escape. The storm beat down harder, soaking him until he looked small, nothing like the man who once dragged her out into the rain to humiliate her. Amelie stood still, calm, untouched by his desperation. She looked at him, not with anger but with a strength that came from survival. Her voice was steady as she said, "When you dragged me into the rain, you never realized I was the shelter. Now, stand in the storm you created." She turned and walked back into her building, her daughter's laughter echoing faintly inside. Kwame stayed behind, drenched, broken, forced to face the storm alone. And just like that, the empire he thought he owned was gone, while Amelie's new world thrived brighter than ever.